Hi, this is Dr. Steve Thompson, Chapter 7, Ethics. This is the nature of corrections. So, the prison explosion, again, this started, really kicked up in the late 70s, early 80s, and they just started putting people in prison. They're like, lock them up. It was very, very politically popular. And so building prisons and being able to sentence people to prison and just passing all these laws that put people in prison really, would put a politician on the map. And there was no politician out there willing to do anything different. Like, hey, let's bring this down a little bit. Let's back off some of these prison sentences because they start to look, they would look weak. For instance, Louisiana has on the books today a law that says if you are convicted of rape of a child under 12, the punishment is either life without parole or death. You could be executed for that. That's still on the Louisiana law books today. But the United States Supreme Court, I believe in 2007, said no, that's not allowed. I disagree with the Supreme Court. I liked it that Louisiana, personally, you may disagree. We all have different opinions. I liked it that we could execute a person who raped a child, but the Supreme Court said that would be cruel and unusual. Also, they deemed it cruel and unusual punishment to execute someone who's mentally ill, to execute a person who was a juvenile at the time they committed the offense. So, but they are the controlling authority. But no politician is going to step in and say, well, the Supreme Court said we couldn't do this anymore. They're not, and so let's change the law. They're not going to do that for two reasons. One, what politician is going to go, oh, let's change a law that says it makes it better for sex offenders? And the second reason is maybe someday they challenge the Supreme Court or to the Supreme Court again and say we should be able to execute. And then, that would be back on the table. For instance, they changed their mind and, relatively recently on Roe v. Wade. It was permissible or impermissible for states to ban abortions. But recently, the states can now ban abortions, so that's just one of those instances where, the law wouldn't change. But like I said, it became politically popular to put people in prison for very long periods of time. Be tough on crime. Anybody being weak on crime would have a pretty rough time. So I'm not going to go through the stats with you, but, not all of them. But, there was a massive amount of spending increase and a massive amount of increase in personnel that went to prison during the prison explosion, which I would say they stopped building prisons roughly 10 years ago. They're not really expanding like they were before because they finally realized the investment is just not working. So we could build prisons from now until the dawn of time. They would just find criminals to put them in, if they had the beds, they would just keep sentencing lower and lower and lower levels of offenders to the prison system. But again, it's not a cost-effective methodology to continue to build prisons, given the amount it actually costs to incarcerate one person. I can't even remember. I've been teaching for a long time. When I started, it was around $30,000 a year. That was 20 years ago. So I imagine it's more than double that now. Probably $40,000, $50,000 a year per person. So, the Eighth Amendment prohibits cruel and unusual punishment. So in the prison system, they have solitary confinement, and you could question the ethics of that. Would a virtuous person put somebody in a dark room by themselves for months or years at a time? And that's what we do, or what our system does. And what is the outcome of that? And the outcome is likely further mental illness. So from a utilitarianist perspective, they come out, it's not, there's not a good outcome. And the method to which they get to the not good outcome is not ethical either. So it's not formalist. It's not, a virtuous person wouldn't make that choice, but it is available. Essentially, if somebody is not abiding by their rules, put them, or just can't be around other people, instead of treating the mental illness, solitary confinement. And I'm no corrections expert. Let me make that very clear. But there are legitimate questions and challenges to the use of solitary confinement. Different types of prisons out there: maximum security, for your worst offenders; medium security that's the overall. It's gonna be your overall abundance of prison systems, and then your minimum security prisons, which are commonly reserved for nonviolent, first-time, and white-collar criminals. Which white-collar criminals is kind of a strange phenomenon. When a white-collar criminal gets caught, no matter what prison system they go into, they tend to never commit a crime again. Mainly, one of the main reasons because they burned all their trust. Like Bernie Madoff, he's passed away now, but you probably have heard his name. He stole billions of dollars in a Ponzi scheme because people trusted him. Well, then when he went to prison and it was all over the news, people aren't going to trust him anymore, so nobody's going to give him any money after that. Or if they do, you're an idiot. It's just like Michael Jackson was accused of molesting children and went to trial and was found not guilty. And later on, the families that accused Michael Jackson of those received significant civil settlements, because they may not have been able to prove in a criminal court that he molested these children. They were able to prove civil liability, which means it's more likely than not that these children were sexually abused and or they settled. So later on, I said, you'd be an idiot to give Bernie Madoff any money after he was convicted and went to prison. But I would think parents would be an idiot to give Michael Jackson their children after the accusations and the trials and the civil liability. But they did, and anyway, those parents, I consider those parents pimps, because they were pimping out their own children by saying, oh, well, here, Michael Jackson, you can spend time alone, with my child as well. It's almost like they were looking for money. But anyway, back on point, white-collar criminals spend a lot of time in prison, in minimum security prisons, because they're considered, nonviolent and smart criminals, we'll say. But they're some of the worst criminals out there. The average bank robbery 15 years ago was around $8,000 for every bank robbery. And then, the white-collar criminals in the hundreds of thousands. I personally worked white-collar crimes cases worth millions. And, they're smart and more effective and cause a lot more financial damage than, someone who commits an auto theft, steals one car. They're going to spend more time in a medium or maximum security prison. So something to think about there. We're not going to go through the history of corrections. Just we'll say the old mentality was prisoners had no rights. You could do whatever you wanted to them. Who's going to listen to them? You could sell their labor. When the prison system first started after the Civil War, it was a very effective method to continue slavery. Just find a lot of black people, say they committed a crime, put them in prison for 20 years, and then use them as slaves that way. They were considered slaves of the state, so that's simple. Didn't have to have any evidence, just say they did something and get a white jury to convict them. So, but as society has progressed, inmates in prison, they still have constitutional rights. A lot of people say, well, no, you lose your rights when you go to prison. Let me make this very clear. This is a common misconception. Nobody loses their rights when they go to prison. Even a person who gets a needle in their arm and you kill them, you don't take away their rights. You actually respected their rights. They went to trial, they were found guilty, they got the opportunity for an appeal, and a jury decided their fate, the judge approved it, so forth and so on. So nobody ever loses their rights. Their rights have been respected at that point. Now, if you go to prison, you don't have the same rights as I do in my office here. You have a lesser expectation of privacy. You have we'll say a lesser expectation of rights, but they're not gone. So if I'm in a jail cell and they want to do a random check of my cell to see if I've got contraband or anything like that, they don't need anything because I have a lesser expectation of privacy in prison. So I just want everybody to know or to understand that nobody ever loses their rights in this country. Even if you're here illegally, if you snuck in through Mexico or Canada, or used a fake passport to come in one of our airports, every person within the borders of this country has the same constitutional rights, even if they're not born here, even if they're not a citizen. A lot of people say it's the citizens, but it's not. In prison, it's not just the inmates. We've got the guards, and with that much power, there can be room for corruption. And there's different types of power that a prison inmate does hold. Legitimate power, which is simply your position. So in this case, I am the professor for this course. I have the power given to me by the university to assign grades, basically. And so that's my legitimate power. I have coercive power to give you an F, to do something negative, to take something away from you, your ability to graduate, your ability to have a good enough GPA to get scholarships. I could say, if you don't submit this paper on time, and I do say this, if you don't take your test on time, you're going to get a 0. Some of you have probably already got some already. That is considered coercive power. But if you submit your test on time and do it the right way, I have reward power, the reward power to give you 100% on the quiz. I can grade your paper, give you 100%. I can give you an A at the end of the course. That's my ability to reward, so that would be that power. My expert power is the ability, is being an expert in a particular field. And I think every one of you out there is an expert in something. Something goes wrong with a computer, a lot of you are probably better than me at handling that. If something goes wrong in flight in an airplane, well, that's my area of expertise. If the airplane flips over and starts spinning at the planet, I could jump in the cockpit and fix it. That's my expert power. I'm an expert in the criminal justice system as well, criminal courts, criminal law, procedural law, civil law, and many other aspects, use of force, drunk driving investigations, and so forth. And lastly, you have referent power, and all these powers can be possessed. We'll say prison guard. A referent power is likability. If you look at somebody and they seem to be a good person and make good conscious decisions the right way for the right reason, they will achieve referent power. You'll hear a story from time to time that an inmate comes in and attacks a prison guard, and another inmate or inmates will step in and attack the prisoner who's hurting the guard and say, no, not this one. He or she is one of the good ones and is a good person and treats us with human dignity, and therefore we're not going to tolerate that. And you'll see that a lot. You'll see inmates on the street. You think a lot. You'll see a lot of people out there go, well, what if I see one of the inmates that I dealt with when I was in prison? I would think a guard that treated people with dignity, some level of human dignity, would not have to worry about that. But some of them do, because they treat them as less than human. They see the opportunity to be mean and use excessive force as we'll say their coercive power. And when somebody does see them, an inmate sees them out, there might be the possibility of a conflict. But anyway. That's a prison guard has a massive amount of power because they have so much power over the people in the prison. That's just the nature of the environment. I'm sure you've heard of it was the Stanford experiment, where they took college students and made half of them prison guards and half of them prisoners, and it basically turned into a regular prison environment where the inmates, students who had never committed a crime before, became disenfranchised, depressed, where the prison guards became abusive of their authority, abusive of the inmates, and so forth. They had to shut it down. It's an interesting study. So kind of scary, actually, that it went as bad as it did. Rewards and punishment in the criminal justice system. Just receiving a period of incarceration, it's punishment, but where indeterminate sentences come in, where they say, you have the opportunity to get out early on good behavior, gives a reward to work through, a reason to behave while in prison, and maybe even set objectives to accomplish, like finishing a GED or a high school diploma. Even some prisons will actually allow inmates to go to college and get a college degree. And a lot of people in our society think, well, I'm not paying for that. That's garbage. I got to pay for my kid to go to school. And I agree with that mentality, except for I also support being frugal with our money. So if it costs $30,000 a year to incarcerate somebody, and it costs me $4,000 a year to send them to college, and if I get them a college degree, they're 20, 30, and these are some real statistics, 20-30% less likely to go back into criminal activity. I'm willing to make that investment because there's a massive cost savings. We're going to be spending a lot less money, $30,000 a year in the future, because we made that small investment on the front end. So yeah, do they deserve the opportunity to go to school and better themselves? No. Is it fair that I took care of my business and took care of my kid and had to pay for it myself and still have to? No, it's not. But it's a good financial investment. So, I do support it in that particular context. We have moved there's a lot of private prisons out there, and private prisons are for profit. One of the scary thoughts of that is, for many years we've been locking up people for possession of marijuana or marijuana related offenses. Yeah. These private prisons spend a lot of money lobbying to keep marijuana a crime. And even though myself as a criminologist, I don't think it should be a crime. It's almost not a crime in most places now. It's either available recreationally or medically. But the sole reason that a private prison wants to keep it as a crime is simply because if you take away a crime, that means less people are going to be in their prisons, and that means less profits for their stockholders. And that's downright evil. Making a decision that affects people's lives in such a manner is evil. It's selfish, and it should not be a factor. It should be what's best for our society. And if I have to let a rapist go because I've got a bunch of people in on drug crimes, we're not doing it right. But it's easy to catch people using drugs. You pull anybody over for anything, you get that sniff of marijuana, because marijuana is really the only drug that smells. A cop can actually smell it when you pull them over. You can't smell cocaine. Well, you can snort cocaine, but you can't really smell it. So anyway, and we don't do that, by the way. If we catch some cocaine, we don't sniff any or rub it on our teeth like they do on Miami Vice. That would be a bad idea. We're strongly discouraged. But with that said, these private prisons, they want to keep everything illegal. That way they put people in jail and they make more money for their stockholders. So it shouldn't be based on that. But they are a private corporation, and just like the cigarette companies, they say we need to sell cigarettes. So we need everybody smoking no matter what it does to them, because the more they smoke, the more money we make. And then, we saw how that went for us and the problems we're still suffering from, in today's society. The motive is profit. I think I've talked about that. Disenfranchisement of inmates. Once an inmate is convicted, serves their time, they're given numerous labels: convict, ex-con, parolee, and it's hard for them to move on from that. And they're very limited on what they can and cannot do. So they are stigmatized for life. And there have been some experiments. I believe it was Florida decided, and a person who was convicted of a felony, if certain felonies, they were allowed to actually lie about their felony conviction, and no expungement. Just say no felony conviction here, and the public was not granted access to that information. So if you went to work, we'll say for Walmart, and they said, "Are you a convicted felon?" They could check no. And it turned out that the recidivism rates for the persons that were allowed to do that, this is a massive study. I forgot it was in Florida. I forgot the name of the study, but anyway, the recidivism rates were double-digit differences as an improvement just for them being able to say, "No, I'm not a convicted felon." And so, from an ethical perspective, would a virtuous person say, "What you did 30 years ago is going to affect you today"? Would a utilitarianist say, you committed a crime 20 years ago, you want to get a job today, but you can't, and you're likely to go back into other criminal activity because you can't participate in pro-social activities such as a decent job, such as possibly education, then the outcome there is negative. And the formalist would say, is this the right thing to do, the right way to do it? And I think from the overall perspective, at what point is a person allowed to serve their time, recover from their mistakes, and become a positive member of society? And so that stigmatization and disenfranchising that lasts forever, it doesn't really work. And so from an ethical perspective, and from we'll say, just like I said, from a virtuous perspective, is this the right thing to do? Do I want to punish this person forever? Some of you may say yes, and there's nothing wrong with that opinion, but from a statistical standpoint, it's ineffective. So something to think about. Last slide you want to look at. So we've got some a case study, And there is something called the Louisiana Justice Reinvestment Act. And Governor John Bel Edwards decided when he was running for governor that he was going to release nonviolent offenders and start taking that money and putting it towards drug treatment and so forth, instead of just wasting our time on the drug war. So it's really a good step in the right direction. But politicians did what they always do. Oh, he's soft on crime. He's going to let all these violent drug offenders go. And it was really comical that David Vitter at the time, who actually got caught with prostitutes, ran for governor and almost won. And anyway, when he ran for governor, he did a campaign ad, and he said, John Bel Edwards is going to release all these people. There's about 5,000 nonviolent drug offenders. And that's actually a good start. We needed to do more. Anyway, but he was going to, risk assessment each one and then release them and save us a lot of money and make room for violent drug offenders. And he did a commercial of this little white girl sitting in her living room, and she's opening the blinds and she see all these black people that are out there released from prison and doing the drugs and stuff like that. It was pretty comical. So Steve being Steve, I actually wrote an article in reference to that, and I didn't use these exact words, but I pretty much did. I wrote David Vitter likes sex offenders. Rapists. So, because he was so adamant that you had to keep these particular persons in jail, and our laws are written to say that if you are in possession of a handful of drugs, you are going to spend more time in prison than a rapist. So therefore, because Mr. Vitter did not like the release and the efficient operation of of improving the efficient operation of the criminal justice system, he liked rapists. You should know that he was not elected. I'm kind of glad, because I worked for the state at the time, so I can't imagine him, because I wrote it during the campaign, and I was actually scared that he was going to be elected, because I know we live in the real world. But I believe David Vitter's words were dangerous and misleading, and those were my words, but those were also the words of a well-respected sheriff in Calcasieu Parish, Sheriff Tony Mancuso, for him to, because great minds got together and said, this is what we need to do. And I wasn't a part of the decision to release these people, but it was a good idea. It is a good idea. And Louisiana was leading the United States of America in incarceration rates, which means not only were we leading the USA, we led the planet. We put more of our own citizens in jail than any other government or any other place on the planet. And actually, because of those efforts, we're no longer the leading, we're close, but we're no longer leading the USA in incarceration rates, which is a bad thing to lead the USA incarceration rates. We put a lot of people in jail. Anyway, what I would ask you is, as a group, and look at it from an ethical, I say as a group, because this is an online class, as an individual, you've got 1,000 inmates. Sit down and talk with your husband, wife, boyfriend, girlfriend, kids, fellow students, and say, you got to get rid of 30% of the inmates tomorrow. Who's going? Who stays? So these are the types of decisions that have to be made. Sometimes they're mandated by the courts. I think California was ordered at one point to release roughly 14,000 people almost overnight. So because they were just overcrowded. A prison built for 1,000 people was holding 4,000 people. So think about that, and these are some hard decisions, and you're going to get criticized. You release nonviolent drug offenders. Oh, well, now the drugs are going to flood the streets. Okay, well, release rapists. Oh, well, people are going to get raped. People can't walk around without getting raped. There's no easy way to do it. But we got to come up with ideas like the persons who exhibited the best behavior, completed job training, who have a job waiting on them when they get out, who have the family support services when they get out, which would call into other questions. Why is this person getting out who has a family with money, and the poor people are going to stay in prison? That's not fair either. So there's no real easy answer to this. But I would spend 10, 20 minutes arguing with somebody over a glass of wine or a glass of apple juice or whatever you're into, and talk about it. All right, that wraps up chapter 7. We'll see you in chapter 8.